Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I think Paul Quinn's ability to lecture the House on democracy would have been enhanced significantly had he not voted in favour of taking away the right of Aucklanders to have a say on the structure of their local government, taking away the right of Cantabrians to have a say on their form of local government. So I think the public will be pretty sceptical about being lectured on democracy by Mr Quinn. It's good to see Hone Harawira in the House debating this bill. I agree, as I have previously when he's spoken on this. I've agreed with many of the comments that he has made. I look forward to seeing him voting against this bill. It's good to see when the Māori Party actually vote with their conscience rather than voting with the government, so we will welcome him and his opposition to that. Mr Speaker, I come to this debate with some reluctance because, as with many debates on law and order, the comments of those who are opposed are likely to be misinterpreted and wrapped up in bumper sticker slogans. Mr Speaker, I think that those who perpetrate serious violent crime need to be held accountable for their actions. I think we need to consider victims in all of this, but that does not mean that I agree with the three strikes bill. And I think that we have to get past the point in this House where anybody who disagrees with a particular measure on law and order is labelled as soft on crime, not caring about victims, condoning the actions of offenders. None of those are necessarily true. I don't condone the actions of violent offenders, and I do have a lot of compassion and sympathy for the victims of crime. I simply do not believe that this three strikes legislation is going to reduce crime or leave victims better off. And I don't think that it's right for anybody on any side of the House to suggest that those in favour or those opposed are hard or soft on crime depending on the way they're voting on this bill. I think the public of New Zealand deserve better in the debate on law and order. They deserve to see their elected members of Parliament actually debating these issues seriously, looking at the evidence and the submissions that are presented, including looking carefully and seriously at the submissions, the minority submissions put forward by those who oppose this legislation. Yes, I know the overwhelming majority submitted in favour of this legislation. It's easy when you're given a postcard and told to sign it, which is what the vast majority of those submissions in favour of this bill were. They were postcards that were signed by people, handed out no doubt by the Sensible Sentencing Trust. So I'm very suspicious of the numbers when they're saying that people are overwhelmingly in favour of this bill. Mr Speaker, I have a huge amount of compassion for the victims of violent offences and those who are associated with the victims of violent offenders. I understand, although perhaps don't necessarily feel it myself, the desire on the part of some of those people for vengeance against the offenders, but I hope we can move beyond that, and I hope we can move beyond that to look at the causes of the criminal offending, because I would much rather prevent the violent offending, any form of criminal offending, from happening in the first place than deal with it after the fact. I think actually we would really demonstrate that we take the concerns of victims seriously if we took action to ensure there were many, many fewer of them in the first place. And unfortunately, this legislation does nothing to reduce the number of victims that are created in the first place. We've seen some disgraceful examples of political rhetoric in this debate that simply don't square up with the facts. We had the indignity of the Minister in the chair in the committee stage, Judith Collins, standing up and saying that the only violent crime in New Zealand took place in South Auckland, and that anybody that lived outside of South Auckland had no right to talk about violent crime, because how could they possibly understand? I think that's an absolutely disgraceful position for the Minister of Police and the Minister of Corrections to be taken. First of all, it's a dreadful slur on all of the people who live in South Auckland, and second of all, it's a slur on the people in the rest of the country to suggest that they don't know anything about violent crime and that they can't sympathise with the victims of violent crime. That's absolutely wrong. Mr Speaker, I want to make a mention about the reporting of violent crime and crime statistics, because we hear crime statistics bandied around the House a lot in justification for this bill, and along with a lot of the other law and order measures. And I want to say that actually, to some extent, the increased reporting of crime, the increased reporting of violent crime, is a good thing. A lot of violent crime previously got swept under the carpet. It went unreported. It went unnoticed, particularly in the case of domestic violence. A big contributor to the increased violent crime statistics is actually domestic violence. And I think the fact that that's now being reported and it's being properly handled is a really good thing. And I think that we shouldn't be alarmist about the increase in the reporting of domestic violence. I don't think that domestic violence is happening more than it used to. I think it's being brought out into the open. It's being dealt with. That's really good. That's something that we should be proud of. We should be happy that people aren't just turning a blind eye to it. They're actually reporting it. It's being dealt with. The problems with the three strikes policy, I want to canvass some of the issues that have been raised. First of all, there isn't much evidence to suggest that longer sentences actually reduce crime. They don't. Longer sentences don't reduce crime. The three strikes bill provides no incentive for good behaviour, and that's something that we should be very wary of. We're sending prison guards into the prison at the same time as we are removing the incentives on the violent offenders to actually reform their ways, shape their acts up. We're putting prison guards at risk if we remove all of the incentives for the prisoners to actually tidy up their act and reform and behave properly in prison. We are placing even more of a burden through this bill on the victims themselves. We are less likely to see guilty pleas for violent offending. We are more likely to see appeals. All of these things drag out the process for the victims of violent crime, leave the victims of violent crime even more exposed. This bill removes judicial discretion, and one of the most fundamental parts of a fair law and order system is providing the judiciary with the discretion to cope with different situations. This bill removes that discretion. In fact, what it does is it hands it to the police instead. It means that the police will have all of the discretion in the plea bargaining before charges are brought before the courts, rather than the judges having the discretion in the sentencing. So we're more likely to see the police bargaining before a charge is brought to say, hey, look, if you plead guilty to this lesser charge that's not a three strikes offence, we won't put that forward as your charge. You plead guilty, and that circumvents the judicial process. It's not fair law and order. It isn't fair, and actually people could get off lightly. The offenders could end up getting off lightly if there is plea bargaining going on between the police and the offender in order to lower the bar, lower the potential charge that's brought before the courts. Yes, Mr Quinn mentioned the process issues. I do think it's concerning that we're considering a significant justice issue, an issue to do with justice, where the Ministry of Justice was excluded from the Select Committee process, where their regulatory impact statement raised a significant number of concerns about this bill, and they were not given the opportunity to flesh those out and to actually debate on those. I think that's an abuse of the democratic process. Yes, I think that is something that the public should be concerned about. The Attorney-General raised similar concerns. The Attorney-General, the National Party's own Attorney-General, raised significant concerns with this bill. Those have not been adequately addressed. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party does agree with tougher penalties for violent offenders. If you look back on the track record of Labour in government, we increased the minimum non-parole periods for serious violent offenders. We did hold people in prison longer. We did make it possible for people to be detained if that was for longer, if that was in the best interests of the victims, if they were likely to be repeat violent offenders again. We did do those things. We don't agree with the three strikes bill. I think, Mr Speaker, it would be much better to give serious consideration to the causes of criminal offending in the first place, to have a serious and honest discussion about the role of mental health in criminal offending in New Zealand, to have a serious and honest discussion about the role of illiteracy, innumeracy, low levels of education in the role of criminal offending. We should be talking about the cycle of violence and victimisation, because many offenders are themselves victims and were victims beforehand. Many of our most violent offenders were victims of violent crime quite often in their childhood. And if we turn a blind eye to that and we don't deal with that, then they are more likely to become violent offenders. That's something that we should have an honest discussion about. And yes, we should look at honestly and openly at the link between socioeconomic status and criminal offending, because crime is more likely to take place in low socioeconomic areas. Criminal offenders are more likely to be from low socioeconomic areas. Let's have a discussion about those causes of criminal offending, rather than this lock them up and throw away the key mentality that too often characterises the law and order debate. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Dr Cam.